Hello and welcome to Charch Chat. I'm Paul Charchian from LeagueSafe.com. Thanks for joining us as we look back at the weekend, the divisional playoff round from a fantasy perspective here at Open Sports. Thanks for joining me. Today we're going to do the AFC. Tomorrow the NFC. In the past I've lumped them together, but it gets way too long, and this way you can spend a little more time on specific players and games. Let's begin with the Tennessee Titans. Kerry Collins looking okay, as usual, just that arm just serviceable, and you've got to wonder, he'll turn 37 next year. So, will that arm end up sort of fading away, much like Brett Favre's did over the course of this season? Will his end up fading away at some point? And I'm a little bit worried. I mean, Collins right now able to basically make the throws he needs to make, and he's still got a little something in that arm. I heard one of the broadcasters say he's got the same arm he had when he came into the league, which is ridiculous, but it's serviceable right now. I just worry about whether or not it's going to be next year at 37 years old. One of the big mistakes this team made is they threw his arm off. 42 passes. They only ran 26 total times between Lendell White, Chris Johnson, their star backs, just 26 carries between them. Big mistake, especially when Chris Johnson, 11 carries, 72 yards. You know, you're making 6.5 yards a carry. You know, you really ought to get the ball a little more often, and that was a big mistake. The Tennessee, when they go back and look at this film, they're going to wish they gave the ball more to Chris Johnson in a close game rather than throwing as much as they did. They really went out of their core competency, which is to run the ball and big plays through the running game. That was a big mistake for Jeff Fisher and his offense. Chris Johnson looked great. He'll be a first rounder next year, almost certainly. Justin Gage put up 135 yards, and I think it's worth mentioning that he has scored or topped 100 yards in 3 of his last 4 games. So Gage is looking really nice at the end of this season. My only hesitancy for next season in projecting him as a nice quality sleeper is, again, the arm of Kerry Collins and where that leaves him. If that arm goes out at the halfway point of the season, where do you go from there? But still, very happy with Gage. He's a 6-year pro. There aren't that many 6-year pros that end up putting up really meaningful numbers and kind of turning the corner, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You know, usually by your 6th year, you kind of are what you are, but he's gone from a 6-year guy who was kind of invisible to a 6-year guy who's played pretty darn well. So, you know, we'll see what he does next year, but I think he is a sleeper worth paying some attention to. In Baltimore, Joe Flacco ends up playing a game that looks good, not great, but the key for him, as it's so often been down the stretch this year, no costly mistakes. He did not throw an interception. He's thrown 0 interceptions in 6 of his last 8 games, and that's a lot of the success that he's having right now. Now, from the fantasy standpoint, you don't get a lot out of him because the touchdowns aren't there, but he's not killing you with interceptions either. I just really hope that next year they open things up and they let Joe Flacco throw the ball around more and be more assertive and go start winning games instead of simply not losing them. While it's great that he's not losing games for them, I think we need to do more with Joe Flacco next year, and he'll probably be a second fantasy quarterback. I'd like to see him develop next year into a guy that puts up some meaningful numbers, and he's got quality receivers. Derek Mason's having a really nice second half of the season. He put up 78 yards and a touchdown on Saturday. He's got touchdowns in 5 of his last 7 games. Derek Mason, he's 34 years old. He'll be 35 next year. And if it weren't for that age factor, I'd really be talking about him as a great sleeper next year. As it stands, he's still a good sleeper. But, you know, I wish he were 25. I wish we were talking about Joe Flacco to Derek Mason the way we're talking about Matt Ryan to Roddy White, but we can't because of the age difference. Maybe Mark Clayton ends up ultimately being the guy that Joe Flacco ends up developing a lot of chemistry with. We'll see. Leron McClay knocked out of this game. Not that it really mattered. He was 12 for 12 when he got knocked out. 12 carries, 12 yards. He was replaced by Willis McGahee, who wasn't any better. So the running game never got on track for Baltimore, yet they were still able to succeed. That you tend to think of Baltimore as a running offense, that they grind it out, but you know, they managed to pull out a win, granted a very low scoring win, with their passing offense. Let's go to San Diego as they took on Pittsburgh in the Sunday game. Of course, LT did not play with a groin injury. I think that's good news for fantasy guys for next year, because what we didn't want to have is a re-injury or turning a modest groin injury into a severe one that hampers him going into next season. I believe right now he's going to be fine for next year. I will address LT's value more directly coming up over the course of this week for next year, because that is a head scratcher what to do with LT, and I'll give you some firm advice on where to take LT. Philip Rivers impressed me again, and boy, does that kid got leadership and moxie, and it's running out of positives to say about him because I've said so much about him the last few weeks and even throughout a lot of this season. 3 touchdowns, 300 yards, led his team nicely in the fourth quarter. Just a lot to like about Philip Rivers as this team looks to be evolving from an LT-dominated offense to one that really is centered around the quarterback position like so many others. And Rivers just another solid performance. Darren Sproles with his first start didn't do much as a runner, about a yard per carry, but he was playing Pittsburgh, and that has a lot to do with it. And Pittsburgh will humble a lot of good running backs. Of course, Sproles heading into free agency. I hope he stays where he is because he's got a great situation where he can do a lot of things as the number 2 guy. I don't think there are going to be too many teams that are going to be sending big money Darren Sproles' way to be the number 1 starting running back. And so I hope he stays where he is. If he doesn't, we'll certainly be breaking down, what his fantasy value is in his new home. But didn't do a lot here. He did have a nice catch and run for a 62-yard touchdown, however, and we give him credit for that, of course. Chris Chambers continues to be very, very quiet. Get this, he hasn't scored since week 5. Chris Chambers, no touchdown since week 5. He never topped 83 yards all season. For a guy who came out looking great, scored all those touchdowns early on, and then just, he had the injury, and then that was the end of this. That was basically it. Even when he returned, he was a shell of his former self. Vincent Jackson, however, has picked up the slack, scoring and or topping 100 yards in 4 of the last 6 games. And while Chris Chambers might technically be the number 1 guy at the receiver position for San Diego, fantasy players, we know that Vincent Jackson's really the number 1 guy for fantasy use. Let's go to the Steelers. Ben Roethlisberger, nice game. Quality start after his concussion. Spread the ball around really well. 6 receivers had multiple receptions in this game, and I was impressed with Roethlisberger. A lot of different passes throughout the field. He had some short stuff, mixed in some long passes here and there, and went for it downfield a few times. I liked all of that. He looks fine. The concussion obviously not a big problem. Another one of those games where he puts together a good NFL game, not a good fantasy game. We saw a lot of that this year. Last year, he put up a lot of good fantasy numbers, even when he wasn't necessarily playing great football. This year, it's been reversed. He's played some really good football under some tough conditions, and just hasn't materialized into box scores that fantasy guys can use. Ben Roethlisberger will be a nice value play at your draft next season. Willie Parker was the star of the offense, though. 146 yards and 2 touchdowns. Gary Russell sniped what could have been a 3rd touchdown. It really looks like the Steelers' effort to keep him fresh for the end of the season by mixing in a lot of Mewelde Moore has paid off, as he got almost all the carries, and he looked to be playing at a whole different speed level than everybody else on the field. Willie Parker will continue to be a factor throughout these playoffs. And last thing I want to mention, Hines Ward, who it just built for cold weather, right? He's not the fastest guy, so you put him on a cold field with, long turf. It slows everybody down a lot. And now Hines Ward, who's so strong with the great hands, the perfect route running, he becomes a monster. And he had a very good game. It wasn't a giant game, it wasn't a big box score game, although he did get knocked down at the 2-yard line. But still a very good game for him, and I think we're going to hear more from him throughout the playoffs. He is really your prototypical cold weather receiver, and a nice game for him. Very happy about that. All right, there's the AFC for you. I will get to the NFC tomorrow, so I hope you'll come back to Open Sports. If you have any questions for our fantasy staff, send us an email, fantasy@opensports.com.
Think you can complete the drive? Play today and get an automatic entry to win daily prizes, 2 tickets to the big game, and a brand new car. Start your drive today at opensports.com.